Greetings to baristas. No doubt you've been subjected to the propaganda ad by Thomas Peterffy all over YouTube, the Hungarian-American immigrant, telling us how he escaped the stifling repression of socialism to become what he is today. And what is he? A billionaire stockbroker, a Bernie Madoff yet unjailed, making a damn good backhanded pitch for socialism precisely because it prevented the rise of money market parasites like him, ruining society to keep its profit margins high and tax rates low. The people who led the Hungarian uprising of 1956 were not fighting for the kind of parasite society embodied by Thomas Peterffy, with his aristocratic family surname. The Budapest rebels of 1956 explicitly stated they were fighting for a democratic, socially just, liberal society, the very thing billionaires like Peterffy are fighting so hard to destroy in his adopted country of the United States. Peterffy and his agenda are proof not that democracy and socialism are incompatible, but that capitalism and democracy are mortal enemies in a zero-sum game of conquer or die. And so far capitalism is winning because democracy, or the people who claim to believe in it, have not the faintest fucking clue as to what it really means. Democracy stands not for the mere representation of the people, but their empowerment. By this I don't mean some cheap cliche slogan of all power to the people, but their practical responsibility to manage directly and operate a society which by right is theirs. Representative government is a half measure, a compromise facade created by lawyers where citizens pay them on retainer to go before a public body and argue their case, except in practice the opposition has slipped him a few grand under the table to lose the case. In this scenario, the opposition will always win because the opponent of real democracy is always the man with the loot, looted from your labor, to buy off the guy you send to make your case for you. So, Azov, how is democracy compatible with socialism? You're not trying to tell us that the Soviet Union or People's Albania solved the problem any better. No, I'm not. For one thing, the problem was framed differently. Democracy was framed socially rather than individually, hence the original moniker of social democracy. The Soviet Union was governed by men of poor background who would never have had a chance to make something of themselves in the Russia of old, or the Western democracies of today, because they were too far down the social scale to matter. The Russian Revolution made possible public education and upward mobility, as well as addressing issues of public health, housing, minority rights, gender equity, and labor in ways that a capitalist society can't, because it has to balance the rights of inherited proprietors. Peterffy's Hungary never had any real democracy on the ground until the land reform of the mid-1940s broke the feudal aristocratic landowning class once and for all. That is why he hates socialism, because it ended the rule of rich individual parasites who lived off the labor of others with no rights because they were poor. This does not justify trampling individual rights into socialism, or anywhere else for that matter, because no one needs civil rights more than the poor. The right to speak, to write, and to learn how to free combination, free assembly, and free mobility, freedom from racial or religious or gender discrimination. The poor man or woman is in more need of these protections than anyone, just like the poor man or woman is in more need of health, education, and social security than those with money. We see under capitalism these rights for the poor and working people are consistently attacked by those with money because the rights of the poor man and woman consistently get in the way of the flow of capital, the only freedom that really matters to the likes of Thomas Peterffy. The regimes of Eastern Europe ultimately rested on bayonets, like the absolute monarchies of old or the fledgling pro-Western democracies in the Middle East. When the rulers, or the soldiers behind them, were no longer willing to use the bayonets, the regimes crumbled. That's why the Soviet bloc collapsed and China did not. No sooner did the Berlin Wall open at Brandenburg than in swooped the Western democratic missionaries, peddling the holy doctrine of salvation through free market democracy. Never mind that it too rests on bayonets, openly as in Pinochet's Chile, or covertly as in the USA under Homeland Security, itself a reinvention of the Cold War Internal Security Act. There was embodied in socialism, and in the states calling themselves such, a perfectly valid mechanism for countering the Western missionaries and the pitfall of multi-party parliamentary special interest corruption. Those former socialist states had organized public bodies of trade unions, women's and youth associations, and of national minorities that had direct representation in their national legislatures. These organizations were under the control of a single party, but freed from party control, and Marx never confused the rule of the working majority with the single political machine or its great leaders. Such an arrangement is at its core profoundly democratic, much more so than in the Western model. It's that public empowerment of workers, youth, women, and minorities that is the essence of socialism more than state ownership of production per se, and it's infinitely more democratic than a party or many parties of so-called representatives. Removing the guiding hand of parties from citizens' bodies and government from at-large corruptible representatives would open the vista of a true people's democracy, a democracy that works for people. one that truly represented, worked with, and worked for the social interests of the majority. Is a legislature with real workers in its seats going to vote for a privatization that puts them out of work? Are young people going to vote for annexation by NATO so they can be stuffed into uniforms and sent to Iraq for someone else's war? I don't think so. Nor is the legislature with the firm women's component going to stand by and let their reproductive rights be stripped from them, no matter how strongly religious fundamentalists pander to faith and family. Where national minorities have their due representation, we're not going to see them declared non-citizens because they were born in the country to the wrong parents who arrived after a certain cutoff date, as we see in the Baltic democracies. I'm proposing an essential grassroots kind of democracy, the only kind that really matters, vaguely preserved in the form of New England town councils. This is what the Western missionaries of 20 years ago came to fight and destroy. They didn't fear the dirty bathwater of communism, but the baby in the tub. That's what had to be either slipped into the straitjacket of Western capitalist democracy or strangled outright, preferably by its own parents, as Lech Walensa's betrayal of Polish solidarity graphically illustrates. As was said of other missionaries of old, that they'd scour heaven and earth to make one convert and turn him into twice the servant of Satan as themselves. Which reminds me of the old folk saying, when your mother sells you to the gypsies, is she any longer your mother? Just so were the peoples of Eastern Europe bought, traded, and sold out on the open market of nations by people like Thomas Peterffy, whose goal is to do the same unto you. That is why the likes of People's Hungary had more potential to be a democracy of, by, and for the majority of its people than the capitalist autocracy endorsed by Thomas Peterffy. Democracy is what Peterffy fears, not socialism, not a single-party dictatorship. He'd have no trouble with bayonets in the streets if he felt his money in sufficient danger from the 99% rabble beyond Wall Street. Well, excuse me. Knock on the tube line. Hello? Alexander Hamilton, author of the Federalist Papers. So what does a reactionary old aristocrat like you have to say about democracy? You're one of the reasons it's just a shadow now. Because you argued that basic liberties depend ultimately on the general spirit of the people. So if their concern for freedom, justice, or humanity decays, no Bill of Rights can preserve it. How do you know it's decayed? When the public believes that poverty equals justice, that freedom equals wealth, and that the barrel of a gun equals humanity. Well, in that case, it seems we've got a zombie democracy, all right, shuffling around those big public tombs on the Potomac. Washington ain't laid out in white marble for nothing.